Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly with Randall Schwartz. Episode 145 for December 15th, 2010. Jono Bacon and Severed Fifth. It's time for Floss Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing to you every week, or as often as we can get to it, a show about open source software. Today's show is a little special. For one, for those of you that are trying to watch this as a video, there's not a video forum for this one. We're just doing an audio for reasons I'll explain in a moment. For two, I don't have a co-host this week. I hope you'll forgive that based on who the guest actually is. A former co-host, our one and only, Jono Bacon. Yes, in fact, we are getting the band back together, almost literally, because today we're going to be talking about Jono Bacon's Severed Fifth project, which is a project to really put his money where his mouth is on open source music, as well as the whole open source movement. So I hope you'll enjoy this particular show. Before I actually get to the interview, a little bit of a programming note for those of you that were expecting the previous show to be, or even this show, I guess, to be the show about open pilot UAVs. We had a preemption by Leo Laporte himself attending and presenting at Loeb. Sorry about that, but they occupied our live recording time, and I made the decision about midway through that we probably should just go ahead and roll these guys over. That'd be a bad thing to do to a plane, but I mean roll it over in the calendar. So they're actually scheduled now for January 12th. We will be bringing them back. I saw some of the preview material. I am really excited about this upcoming show. Aaron Newcomb will, in fact, also join us as the co-host, as already planned. Also, you may have noticed a slight gap in the schedule as you're listening to this, most likely, if you listen to it almost immediately in the feed, as I often do to my podcasts. I am now out on a cruise ship somewhere in the Western Caribbean with Sky and Telescope magazine. We have a program that's looking at astronomy, in particular the lunar eclipse that's happening probably right about now. It depends on what time of day I guess you're listening to this, but wonderful show. So there'll be another gap next week because, again, I am not in a position where I can record a live show, and I didn't bank up any pre-recorded shows as I try to do from time to time. So that's a little programming note for you, but that's not why you're listening. You're listening to hear the content of today's show. This is a really, really cool show. I've been calling this the very special holiday edition of Floss Weekly, and I will just go ahead and get right into the interview. Let's go ahead and bring Jono on. So hello, Jono.
Hello.
Hey, good to talk to you again. You know, I've got to say, the Floss Weekly listeners are very loyal, and they're very loyal to you, because there's not a week that goes by when someone doesn't say, when you going to bring Jono back? When you going to bring Jono back? Just wanted to let you know that you're well missed, very missed.
Deranged individuals that they are.
Yes, and I have to say that, you had provided for many of those shows an aspect of the whatever we were talking about that I really just didn't have. So that was really nice, too, because I don't know much about Linux, and apparently you know a little bit more than I do about Linux, so that really helped.
Not much. Marginal information. Everything I read is in the back of a cereal box, So.
Yep. Well, what's been keeping you busy since you've been away from our show?
Well, yeah, things have been pretty hectic, and particularly with Severed Fifth. I've been busy with work and busy with other stuff, but Severed Fifth is my new big project, and it's really progressing at one hell of a pace. So I'm really pleased with it.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that. So, what is Severed Fifth?
So Severed Fifth is basically a music project that I set up a little while back. The basic background of it is that a few years ago I was hearing lots of blatherings in the press about how Nine Inch Nails and Radiohead were experimenting with Creative Commons licensing for their music, and how this was the new music industry. Mm-hmm. And being the cynical arsehole that I am, because I'm English and that's how we roll. I basically, the first thing that struck me was, well, hang on a second, Nine Inch Nails and Radiohead, they have their reputations forged from the traditional music industry, where you sign a record deal and you sign your distribution rights to a label, and they market it, and then hopefully you're successful. Mm-hmm. it didn't really tell me anything about regular bands, and I've been playing in metal bands since I was 16. And I was with the bands that I've been in, you spend a lot of time playing shows, and you play with lots of support bands. I mean, most metal shows will have 4 or 5 bands on, and it didn't tell me whether the Creative Commons free culture music industry is good for those bands. Is it good for bands who aren't? Who don't have a reputation from the previous music industry.
So, in other words, you're saying that it's okay for somebody like Radiohead to do it because they've already been established. So they can afford to give away some stuff for free to kind of really simplify the argument.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're a millionaire, it's easy to be generous, essentially. Yeah. And that was kind of the analogy I was thinking about. Mm-hmm. So it didn't really tell me. And so my thinking was, well, wouldn't it be cool to have a bit of an experiment and to see how far a band could push it under the Creative Commons licensing way of doing things, who isn't well known. And around that time, I was moving to the US, and this was back in 2008. So I set up Severed Fifth as and announced it as a project to basically see how far an individual musician can take music. And I did it myself because, I was moving countries, so I didn't have a band and all the rest of it yet. In fact, I just, because I was moving countries, I was wrapping up my previous band in England, Seraphidium. So I basically wrote an album called Denied by Rain, put it out there, and it was a pretty intense, brutal death metal album. I mean, it was... Mm-hmm. There's a lot of grunting and growling and bashing of pots and pans in that album, and but I moved to the US, and I recorded the album. I put it out there under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. Some people seem to enjoy it, but I didn't really have a lot of time to really push the band. Mm-hmm. So I moved over here, and everything was going well. I got married, started settling into my new Californian lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And a couple of years passed, and I got busy with things like writing a book, and things have been really busy at work and all the rest of it. And then I started feeling the itch to really resurrect Severed Fifth and do it right. To get an album together, to put together a live band, to get out and play some shows, and to really do it well. And the other thing was that the music changed as well. The first album, like I said, was a really pretty brutal death metal album. I started working on new material, which is much more accessible. It's instead of growling all the way through it, I sing and growl in parts, and it sounds like a mix of Iron Maiden and Megadeth. It's the kind of style we're going for. Mm-hmm. So I started writing an album, and I was pretty much about most of the way through it. And I was actually flying back from a trip to New York, and I was in Detroit Airport, and I met up with this guy called Chris Kontos, who used to play in a big metal band called Machine Head. He plays in a band called Attitude Adjustment. He's played in a bunch of other bands as well, like Testament and Conqueror. Mm-hmm. And so this guy's an idol of mine. I met my idol in an airport. In fact, I learned to play drums really from listening to him. And I told him about Severed Fifth, and I'd written this album, but I'd not recorded it yet, and the whole ethos surrounding free culture and the new music industry and all the rest of it, and he was just stoked about it, and he put me in touch with some other musicians, and it really started going from there.
Now, does that when he was getting excited by it, is this something that he had considered already, or were you able in a short conversation to sell the idea of what really you're trying to do?
I'd really got this elevator pitch down because I've been thinking about this. I mean, when I was originally thinking about it back in 2008, mm-hmm. My initial hunch was basically, you know what? Music should be free, because I was basing it essentially on the open source way of doing things. If you give software away for free, then it allows people to share it, and if you can share it, it means that more people have access to it, and it brings the content provider and the content consumer closer together. So for me, back in 2008, it was all about giving music away for free, but I'd spent a couple of years stewing on this and thinking about it, and it made me realize that giving the music away for free is one tiny component. So let me outline the problem and
sure.
where I think the solution is, and then you can all wake up again. So basically, the way the music industry traditionally works is you're in a band, you get together a band, you put some music together, you go out and play a load of shows, and then you hope that somebody's going to see you, an A&R person from a record label, and take interest in you. Or you record an album and you approach a record label. What happens is you then create a product, a record, and you sign your distribution rights to the label. So the label basically have control over where it's distributed. If they, you can't necessarily distribute it yourself. They are basically in charge. Now, then, what they then do is they then invest a certain amount of money into marketing it and working with distributors to get it into record shops and into the iTunes music store and all that kind of stuff.
Almost trying to force the listeners closer to you so they can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, record labels are basically glorified marketing and distribution companies. That's what they do. Then typically what happens is, is if you do well, then the label. If it's a good label, the label will put the album in lots of stores, so lots of people buy it. And then when you sell a certain amount of copies, often a label will say, if you sell a certain amount of copies, we'll then give you tour support. So let's say you sell 30,000 copies in the US, we'll then send you on a tour, or we'll fund you to go on a tour with another band. Because if you want to go on tour with a big band, you typically have to pay. A lot of people don't realize this, that a lot of the support acts that you see when you go to see a main band, they actually pay to go on tour to do that, and it can cost. Like a friend of mine was in a band, and he went on tour with a band called Slayer, and I think they paid $100,000 to do that for a 36-date tour. So it's pretty expensive. So the challenge has been is that what's happened is the music industry has basically has been a victim of the economic downturn. So it means that in some cases with many labels, more bands are being signed, but less marketing is going into them. We've seen the same thing in publishing. I'm sure you're familiar with this, Randall, with publishing.
Absolutely.
Is that some publishers, they will only sign a few books. Like O'Reilly are good about this. They'll sign a few books, but then they'll do a decent job marketing them. And then some other publishers, who shall not be named, will take on hundreds and hundreds of authors, but provide barely any marketing, but lots of royalties. And then, but because it doesn't sell any books, you don't get any royalties. So
I've had books in both kinds of publishers, and if people look at my bibliography, you can kind of see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same with me. I mean, it's a bit of a mug's game unless you know what you're doing. So what's happened with the record industry is bands, the idea of being signed to a record label is incredibly exciting for a band. So people get wooed by the romance of it. So they sign to a label, and then what they do is they sign their distribution rights to the label. The label doesn't have a lot of money to market it. So what happens is barely anyone gets to consume the product. So, you sign to a label. Many labels don't actually put your album in record stores. Some put them in limited record stores that not a lot of people go to, not necessarily like big stores like Tower Records. So what happens is you don't really sell any albums, which means that you don't get tour support, and which means that you don't get to go on tour, which is what bands want to do. And that's where bands make money, because bands make money from selling merchandise and ticket sales.
And it's also because it's not getting in a lot of stores. It's not getting a lot of purchasing, which means it doesn't end up on, top 100 albums. So even radio stations aren't playing it.
Exactly. I mean, it's the problem is that you basically sign the promotional and distribution rights essentially over to a label. And what happens at that point is if the label doesn't do a very good job, then it really screws you up. If the label does a brilliant job, then you're fantastic. I mean, if the label puts loads of marketing money into it, ads in magazines, all the rest of it, then you're home and dry.
Yeah, and there's also a conflict of interest on the label's part, which is that they're trying to control the distribution because they want to make money off of selling copies of hard copy bits. But they also want it to be heard everywhere. But, of course, that's a conflict because, if you just gave it away for free at that level, you're giving away the only way the label has of making money, which is selling these plastic round things.
Exactly. So I mean, this is the problem that we've got with the music industry. So Severed Fifth is, I believe that we can solve this in a really elegant way. I believe that the answer isn't necessarily bands like Nine Inch Nails and Radiohead doing this. I mean, that's great that they do that, but what we need a groundswell of smaller bands getting out there and doing this to encourage other bands to do it. And the same thing happened with software. The same thing happened with open source. Back in the 80s and the 90s, when we started seeing these case studies, like Linux is a great example. When companies and projects started hearing about Linux, like, oh my